Thank you for joining us on our YouTube channel as we strive to get a more progressive voice of faith out to a larger audience. Our videos are mostly from the pastor at Community Christian Church in Springfield, Missouri, Dr. Roger Ray. We are always pleased to have feedback from our viewers. You can visit our website at spfccc.org or write to us at reverend.drray@aol.com.
Well, let's begin, if we may. Thanks for coming out tonight, and I want to say again to my students that we'll be covering Sacred Paths of the West, the third edition, pages 220 to 246. Those of you with second editions, it's 209 to 235. And let me also remind my students that you have to get approval of your long paper proposal in advance of writing, and it would be great if you chose Islam as your topic, since that's probably the religion you know the least about and need to understand the most. So, and greetings to our YouTube viewers. We'd love to hear from you as well if you have any comments or feedback. This is our second session on Islam, and we want to talk more specifically about what Muslims do to be Muslim. How do you practice Islam? And at the root of everything about a conversation about being Muslim, you have to start with the unity or the oneness of God. That's the primary confession. That's the thing that's going to be repeated at every hour of prayer, that's said into a baby's ear when the baby is born. You say that to a person the day that they're dying. You turn them to face Mecca, and you say that again, that God is one God and Muhammad is God's prophet. Or there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. That is said over and over. And as I told you before, it becomes an easy mantra for Muslim children that whenever they're stressed, whenever they are feeling pressure, taking a test at school or anything, you will hear them repeating that. And we even know, if you remember that airliner that went down in the Atlantic Ocean, in the recording, the co-pilot that was intentionally not just committing suicide, but killing everyone else on the plane, he was saying there is no God but God on the way down to the crash. It's said to calm yourself or to reassure yourself of your relationship with God. Now, as I mentioned last week, Muhammad did not make up the name Allah for God, but he captured a name that was already a part of Arabic society. It was the name of the primary God, but he emphasized that there was no God but God, so that he was eliminating all of the lower gods or lesser deities in traditional Arabic society. Now, the creation of monotheism actually creates a lot of the problems that we have. If you are a truly polytheistic society, you really don't have to worry about eradicating anyone else's religion. You just add gods to the pantheon of gods, which the Greeks did, the Romans did, certainly the Hindus did and do. If you've got a polytheistic system, there's no reason for me to tell you that your religion is wrong. I can tell you what I know about this particular God, and then you can tell me what you know about your God, and there's nothing to fight about. Monotheism makes an exclusive claim. If you've got a religion that's different from mine and I'm a monotheist, then one of us has to be wrong. And that puts the pressure on to change other people's views, to convert people, and to seek affirmation. And in fact, this is true of evangelical Christianity as well as evangelical Islam, or Judaism rarely is, but the pressure to become either Jewish or Zoroaster is, I need to be confirmed in my belief. That if you will listen to my beliefs and change yours, then I'm confirmed that I'm right. And of course, that's one of the issues about numbers in churches. Hopefully you aren't insecure about those things, or we've got big issues. But every time someone comes forward to join the church, then you've got a stranger that's reaffirming your choice. So when you go to a church that's got 5,000 or 6,000 people in it, then you have this constant confirmation of numbers. Monotheism gets addicted to that kind of confirmation. It is very hard for monotheists to get to the point where we can have the liberty to say, I'm pretty sure about what I believe, but you can believe whatever you want to believe. That we don't need to change other people. And particularly in families, you know this to be true, that if you've got a family that's got a strong religious heritage, and in my own history, I married a woman who had grown up in a very strict Church of Christ home, and she had been a missionary in Europe in the Church of Christ and had gone to a Church of Christ college. And so when she married me and I got her to go to a mainstream Protestant church, her parents just went ape. But she had an older brother that never went to any church, and they never bothered him because he had not voted against their church. But Rebecca, by going to a disciple church, had voted against her parents' religion. And when we would occasionally say, why do you give us so much grief? And they gave us a lot of grief. Why don't you worry about Ken for a while? He doesn't go at all. Well, if Ken went, he would go to the right church. So the fact that he doesn't go at all is not a threat, you see. So that's a particular tough issue for monotheists, and it's more tough for Muslims than it is for Christians and Jews because they are so horribly emphatic about the unity of God. For Muslims, God is so alone, so exclusive in divinity that there's really not room for anyone to have any other divine authority. It's almost a surprise to me that they continue to believe in the devil or demons or even angels because they're so exclusive in their sense that God doesn't mingle with nature. God's not the moon or the sun. God's not a season. God's not a growing season. God is God and nothing but God. God is everywhere and in everything, but there's no lesser deities. If you listen to the way that Christians and some Jews talk about Satan, Satan's another god. I mean, Satan's got a lot of power. Satan can do a lot of things. In Islam, they believe in a shaitan, but all shaitan can do is to tempt you or to put a bad thought in you. That's all they can do. Then you create some other theological problems for yourself. If there's only one God, there's only one power in the universe, and He is, or God is, exclusively in charge of everything, then you don't have a lot of wiggle room for why things go badly. Because God is behind earthquakes and tornadoes and pestilence and everything else. It all has to be laid at the feet of that singular God. Now, Muslims are a little tough on the issue of God is so perfect and holy that God is entirely transcendent, has nothing to do with us in terms of intermingling, although they do have several expressions of God's immanence, of the experiences of God and the leadership and the direction of God. But they don't even talk about, I'll get into that in just a second, but they wouldn't even say that human beings are made in the image of God. Because no one is in the image of God. God is alone, exclusive, exalted, and entirely above every created thing. They do, however, ascribe certain qualities to God. Of all the surahs in the Quran, all but one of them, I don't know why that one doesn't, but all but one of them began by ascribing to God the qualities of being most merciful and most compassionate. That is repeated over and over and over again. And if those are the primary qualities of God, then you have to understand that those are primary qualities sought by Muslims. That's not the way the media tries to get us to think about Muslims, but the primary personal character issues that a Muslim wants to inculcate in complete and total surrender to God is compassion and mercy. I wish we heard more of that on TV. People, again, unlike Christianity and Judaism, does not teach that humans are made in the image of God. God has no image to be imitated, and they can be pretty tough about any kind of artistic representation of God or anything else. Humans are special. They're different from the rest of the created universe, but for three specific reasons. One is that we can intellectually discern the difference between what's true and what's false. And we can choose then between the good and the bad. We have moral force. We have intellect, we have moral force, and we can speak. And because we can speak, we can praise God. And you understand it's a religion that revolves around prayer and constant reminders of the presence of God. So the ability to worship separates us from the rest of the created universe. So how then does evil come into the world? Christians will tell you that we are inherently sinful. I mean, we still hear every Sunday include a prayer of confession as a crucial part of virtually every worship service. We almost never have a service that doesn't include a prayer of confession. We grew up with the assumption that probably we're stinkers. Given the opportunity, we are inherently bad. Judaism has possibly a different kind of way of viewing guilt. I think one comedian said that Jews invented guilt, Catholics institutionalized it, and Protestants just turned it into a general feeling of neurosis. But Muslims take the view that everything that God made is good. Everything. People are good. And that by nature, everyone is a Muslim. They would tell you that Noah was a Muslim. They'd tell you that Adam was a Muslim. Everyone by nature of their creation is a Muslim. We just are forgetful. And we have to be reminded over and over again. So most of evil comes from the fact that we forget. And if I forget to pray long enough, I start to think of myself as being the center of the universe, then I am likely to do bad things. But if one will simply keep remembering to say, there is no God but God, Muhammad is his prophet. You keep reaffirming that. You get down and face Mecca, and turning to Mecca is turning towards the location of your place of encounter with God. Whether you've ever been there or not. You turn to Mecca and you say those prayers so you don't forget. Well, it's not untrue. I mean, the constant reminder. When I was a young preacher, I actually had difficulty sometimes. I had a real baby face when I first started, and see what ministry will do to you. But I had difficulty sometimes getting into the intensive care units and hospitals and stuff, because they would just say, well, one nurse told me flatly, maybe your father's old enough to be a minister, but you certainly are not. So there were times that I would wear a collar to go, particularly if I was going into a mental hospital where there were lots of locked doors that you had to get through, or into an intensive care unit. I would wear the clergy collar. Well, you find out if you're wearing a clergy collar, everything else you do that day is under scrutiny. You know, if you go to the mall, if you're filling up your car with gas, if you go out to a restaurant, if you're wearing a collar, you really don't want to smart off to the waitress. You don't want to speed and cut someone off in traffic. I have wondered at times spiritually if I just shouldn't go ahead and wear one every day, especially when I'm dieting, just as a constant reminder. But religious gestures, rituals, symbols are effective reminders. If this is who I've chosen to be, if this is the person I'm trying to be, it actually does help you to remember to behave appropriately. So that's part of the whole thing about the regular prayers, one of the 5 pillars. They do understand that there are people who have simply rejected, and they are called unbelievers. They oftentimes think that Christians are unbelievers because we keep insisting on talking about God having a son. And that offends their sense of the nature of God, that the divine would mingle with human blood and it offends their sense of the unity of God, that there could be more than one divine creature. So they oftentimes will reference Christians as being unbelievers because we miss the number one first point, that there is no God but God. Now the word jihad, which again, most of us encountered in the media. We encountered jihad during the Iranian revolution back in 79 and 80, and we understand jihad to mean let's all go crazy and kill as many Westerners as we possibly can. The word actually means struggle. And I was at Harvard in fall of 2004, but the graduating class that spring, they had chosen a young man, or young by virtue of his grades, who was the valedictorian that year at Harvard, was a young Muslim from Saudi Arabia. And his title of his commencement speech was My Jihad. Now this was 2004 at Harvard. But even Harvard insisted that he change the title of his speech because there were just that many people who said the word jihad is too related to terrorist activity. But what the young man was wanting to talk about was his struggle to be a scientist and a good Muslim and to live in the West but keep his faith. That was his struggle. That's what he wanted to talk about, but he had to change the name of it. There's one famous quote from Muhammad when he and his army had returned from battle, in which he said, I have left the little jihad in order to return to the greater jihad. The greater jihad is the struggle within, the struggle to remember what God made me to be, the struggle to resist evil, to resist temptation, to resist arguing, to resist all of the carnal pleasures that could come from inappropriate sexuality or from alcohol consumption or eating bacon. I know exactly what he means by the inner jihad. It is that struggle that we have to continue to be the person that we want to be. Now, salvation in Islam is not at all what it is in Christianity and not much like it is in Judaism. And salvation in Christianity is a fluid concept. But unfortunately, when we talk about it now, when you say, are you saved, or how am I to be saved, in almost every case, the only thing that anyone's thinking about is how do I get to go to heaven when I die? How do I avoid eternal punishment? And that's not what the original meaning of salvation meant. You could note in some of the gospel texts where Jesus encounters Bartimaeus, who's blind, and he heals him of his blindness. He says to him, go, your faith has saved you. In the house of Simon the Pharisee, the woman of ill repute comes in and cries on his feet, and he says to her, go, your faith has saved you. But in a lot of English translations, they'll say to the woman of ill repute, go, your faith has saved you, because we assume she's a prostitute and she's been forgiven of her sins, and now she gets to go to heaven. But they translate, go, your faith has saved you, when it's said to the blind man who's received his sight. They'll translate that as, go, your faith has healed you. But it's exactly the same word. The word salvation in Greek means to be made whole, to be restored to wholeness. And so where's your brokenness? Salvation in the earliest strata of understanding a Christian's journey into unity with God is to be made whole, to live the life of a whole human being. That, in fact, comes closer to what a Muslim means. Muslims speak of salvation, well, they don't use the word salvation at all. They ask the question of how do I gain felicity? How do I live a life of harmony and fulfillment and meaning? How do I live a life that allows me to live in harmony with God, with my family, with my community, with the Ummah, the worldwide Islam, and hopefully with my neighbors? Now, really, for those of us in the progressive wing of Christianity, doesn't that come pretty close to what we're really after? And I don't know if any of you have difficulty telling people, well, if you don't believe in heaven and hell, how come you still go to church? I mean, I get that kind of comment on my newspaper column online all the time. People just say, well, Roger doesn't believe the Bible, or Roger doesn't believe in God, or Roger doesn't believe in Jesus. Why would they say that? Why would I have spent so much of my life studying Scripture or continue to spend my life as a pastor if I don't believe in Jesus or Scripture or God? Well, I don't believe in a burning hell, and I don't believe in a heaven, literal heaven with streets of gold and mansions. And if you don't believe those things, a lot of modern day Christians don't get it. But I'm going to insist that that is not the earlier strata of Christian conviction. That's not the way that earlier Christians used it. And for those of us that are, making the transition from traditional Orthodox Christianity into a more progressive movement, we may be a little unsure of how even to express ourselves, because you give up false certainty in favor of honest uncertainty. And that exchange doesn't always feel good. It's lovely to have absolute certainty, even when in your heart of hearts you know it ain't so. But you move into honesty with uncertainty, and there's a number of points at which you're just kind of uneasy about life. And I will assure you that it gets easier, because I wouldn't trade honest uncertainty for dishonest certainty, but it's a tough journey. But I think in that sense, the higher form of Islam and progressive Christianity and traditional Judaism probably have similar views of salvation. But when you're reading a textbook like this one, or you're reading a general description, a sociological description of world religions, that's a point at which the author will tell you there's huge differences. But when I look at how I personally feel and react to my faith journey, I don't feel that alienated. Do you? Anybody got any observations about that? Okay. Well, then let's talk about ritual practices in the good life. I find it interesting that the Muslims follow a lunar calendar, but they never adjust it. Jews will adjust their calendar based on the spring equinox, and it gets reset. And if you're going to follow a lunar calendar and you have certain dates in a month of the year, if you don't readjust it, then after a few years, like the month of Ramadan, will move through the seasons of the year, so that sometimes you have a winter Ramadan, sometimes you have a summer Ramadan. It's what Muslims will call hot Ramadan. And there's a huge difference that if in Ramadan you don't eat or drink, no water, nothing, from sun up to sundown, then I want Ramadan to be in December. I want it to come right at the end of December, because I want the shortest day I can get out of that deal. But when Ramadan is in July and the days are 16 hours long and hot, that's a rough Ramadan right there. But they never adjust the calendar. It's a lunar calendar. So their clock is always moving. Now, there are Muslims who will interpret that not as a mistake, not that they don't know how to keep a better calendar, but Jewish tradition, Christian tradition, other major religions, everything is kind of tied to the harvest and the winter, the spring. All of our holidays are tied to agricultural calendars. Well, Muslims are not. It's got nothing to do, because for them, the unity of God is such that God's not interested in whether it's winter or summer or spring. It doesn't matter. Ramadan's going to fall where Ramadan falls, and you observe Ramadan as a faithful Muslim. It doesn't have anything at all to do with whether you're planting the wheat or harvesting the wheat. But, for us, Passover comes in the spring of the year, the first harvest. Pentecost is the celebration of new bread. Christmas was put where it was, not because anyone has any inkling that Jesus was born in December, but because that was a traditional pagan holiday of the winter solstice. And so the date for Christmas was moved mistakenly to December 25th. That's not actually when the winter solstice is, but that's why it was moved to December 25th. Muslims are just not concerned about those things. For them, it is a religion of 7 days a week. It's not that there's any one day that's a great deal more holy than another, or one place more holy than another, or a time more holy than another. They pray 5 times a day, 7 days a week. And that is the most crucial aspect of their praxis of what they do to be a Muslim. Prayers are said first at early morning, then at noon, then mid-afternoon, then sunset, and then before bedtime. 5 times a day. Prior to going to prayer, a good Muslim is going to purify themselves. They'll wash their hands and their face and their arms, clean out their nose, wash, at least pour water over their hair and their ears, and then wash their feet. And so anytime you go to a mosque, you'll see there is a place for ritual cleansing. And man, I've been in Israel in January and February, and the call to prayer goes, and you see these guys going over to a fountain, and it is 32 flavors of cold. And they go ahead and go through this ritual of washing. It's something that you do for God, that you present yourself to God, having at least gone through the ritual of outward cleansing. Again, all of these things help to identify the Ummah. It helps to keep you in community. The same reason you've heard me say before, the reason why we know who the Jews are, we've still got Jews in the 21st century, but you don't have Perizzites, Havites, Jebusites, Hittites, all those people are gone, is the Jews had certain rituals that defined their community. They had a diet, they had a haircut, they had circumcision, they had certain things that you do within their community, certain holidays you observe, times of fasting, and that defines you. You might be living in a pluralistic society wherever you are, but you know who the other Jews are because of when they walk instead of driving their car, because of what they eat and where they shop, and sometimes how they dress. This is how a community holds itself together. You know, even in conservative Christianity and Pentecostals, women don't cut their hair, they don't wear makeup, they don't wear jewelry, they wear long, straight, plain dresses. When you walk into the lobby at the hospital, it's not hard to spot the Amish. You know, but in mainstream churches where can you walk through the lobby at Cox and tell the difference between a Methodist and a Presbyterian? You know, that kind of thing is gone. And I think in many ways this is what's happening to Judaism, that because they're letting go of some of those ritual practices, the continued existence of Judaism is in question. People intermarry, they let go of the dietary habits, the dressing habits, the Sabbath habits, and then the religion just becomes syncretized. This is the number one fear of Islam, is culture war. That American products, American movies, American television have become so prevalent within the Middle East that they are in fear of their culture ceasing to exist. That is the primary thing. When we've been told that they are jealous of our freedoms or whatever, that's not it. They don't want their culture to be extinguished by our culture. And you do hear that from other places. If you've been in France, I don't know what the ratio is, but I think in France on a radio station you got to play at least 2 songs recorded in France for every song you play recorded outside of France. So can anybody... There is a ratio. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but there's a lot of French TV in France, whereas if you go to Israel, almost everything on television are reruns, dubbed from American Hollywood produced stuff into Hebrew. Now again, in terms of practice, it is not actually necessary to go to a mosque. If you pray 5 times a day, 7 days a week, it really doesn't matter. And they don't say that Friday is not a Sabbath. There was never a time in Islam that it was illegal to buy and sell on Fridays, or that you had to observe a different diet or a different behavior on Fridays. But Friday is the most common day of prayer in which you go to a mosque. And it's preferable to go to a mosque, but there's no mosque police. No one's going to come and find out why you haven't been coming to mosque. You go to a mosque, and then you say the same prayers that you would say outside of a mosque, with the sole exception being if the mosque has an imam, there'll be a sermon. And some of those sermons have been what has excited Westerners, because sometimes the sermons are where people begin to get radicalized. But not all congregations have an imam. We don't have one here in Springfield. We have someone who leads prayer, but has not identified himself as an imam. Yeah, Terry?
Is this a mosque or is it just a cultural?
It's a house of prayer.
What?
It's a house of prayer. It's a cultural center, would be a way of saying it. But it's a Muslim house of prayer, but it's not a mosque, not been dedicated as a mosque. An imam, this is kind of a fluid thing, and I wish that we had someone here who was a practicing Muslim that could say a little bit more about it, because there are schools, there are degrees that you can attend and graduate from. There are Sunni schools, there are Shia schools. There are several different versions of Sunni Islam, and if you're living in an intense population of Sunnis, then you might really care which seminary or school of religion that your imam had gone to. But it is not even necessary to have that degree. They're more like the far end of Protestantism, that there is no one to necessarily ordain you an imam or to say this guy is one and this guy isn't. But it is a matter of humility to not call yourself an imam if you can't meet certain levels of expertise to be able to recite a portion of the Quran for having studied the Haditha. So, but there's, I doubt that many mosques with very much membership would ever hire an imam to come and live among them as their religious leader who didn't have a formal education, but it's not required. And, well, you all come from Church of Christ tradition. It's the same for you all, right? I mean, you can hire a preacher who was your mailman last week, but he liked to preach. He was fairly good at it. We like him. We trust his interpretation of the Bible. Coming off the street, you are now the pastor here. But most denominations have some educational requirements and a certain bar that you got to pass. And even still, in the Church of Christ, or Baptist for that matter, where you don't have to have a degree to be ordained, there's still a strong preference for people that have academic credentials. But it's not necessary. An imam is expected to have certain pastoral duties. They're expected to preach, to teach. They are also expected to do counseling, to visit the sick. But they don't have any institutional authority. There's no sense that one Muslim is better than another Muslim. There is no sense that anyone, whether they are in the caliphate, if they are a Muslim ruler, politician, no one is supposed to have more authority than another. And there's a famous story that was recorded in your textbook in Egypt, where there was a caliph whose son lost a horse race to someone else, and he struck the man, and the man went to Mecca and complained to the imams about the fact that he had been struck because the guy was the ruler's son. And the imam sent for the ruler and his son to come to Mecca, and the peasant beat the young man and his father as a sign that no one gets to lord it over someone else. Now, you know that isn't how it's actually played out in practice, but at least that's the idea. Yeah?
Does the imam officiate at funerals, or what do they do when funerals?
Well, it's not necessary. Funerals, and I've actually got death rituals coming up here, maybe pretty quick. Let me get back to that question in just a minute. Of the pillars, we know the confession, we know the prayer. The other is the practice of almsgiving. And in Christianity, wealth is sometimes suspect. Christians are not always clear about this, but wealth is oftentimes suspect, that you can't have too nice a car, you can't have too much jewelry, you can't be too rich, or you are under suspicion of not being sincere. Muslims really don't have that view of wealth. Now, they do have negative views of ostentation, but not of wealth. But your almsgiving is 2.5% of your wealth, and it's almost like a religious tax. It goes to the poor. You can't keep it, And you can't feel good about the wealth that you've got until you have paid your alms. But you can't use those alms to accomplish something that you needed to accomplish anyway. You can't support your parents with your alms. You can't pay a medical bill with your alms. You can't even count your alms to raise money to build a mosque. All that needs to come from somewhere else. And you're not supposed to give alms to Christians or Jews. I mean, it's for Muslims. You're supposed to stay within the Ummah. Yes?
If they don't have any authority within the mosque or the group, then who says where the alms are to go? Is there a governing body?
There's not a governing body, but there's,
Elders and deacons and
yeah,
so forth.
there's not that. No one's going to follow up. There is the haditha. There are the traditions. And people get the teaching. They are told how they're supposed to do it. But there's no policing to be sure it's done. With the exception of certain Muslim nations simply levied it as a tax. No brainer. The government was taking that 2.5% and using it in poverty programs. But I think that is fairly rare for that to be done now. I don't think there's... if there's a nation that does that, I don't know about it. The fourth pillar, fasting in Ramadan, as we were saying, the fast requires that you put nothing in your mouth from sunup to sundown. Not water if it's hot, nothing, unless you're sick. But, you know, like those of us that are supposed to take medications every day, you're not even supposed to take your medicine during those hours. You're not supposed to swallow anything, you know, except where it might be life-threatening to not do it. But, you know, you shouldn't just forget, oh, I forgot to take my blood pressure pill, and rush home at lunchtime and take your blood pressure pill. You are not supposed to put anything in your mouth. But, as severe as that sounds, in the end, it turns Ramadan into a time of festivity. Because when you get home, you're going to eat a lot. And most Muslims will tell you that they have a greater tendency to gain weight during Ramadan than to lose weight, even though they're fasting during the day, because at the end of the day, all the family comes home, and there's this big feast, there's lots of recipes, special things being cooked, and they can stay awake way into the night, eating and talking during this special time. And it is also one of those things that identifies the Ummah. Again, if you're living in Montreal, Canada, and there's like 5,000 Muslims in Montreal and 200,000 Catholics, it's pretty obvious who's observing Ramadan. It identifies you again as a community and glues you together. I said that was the fourth. This is this is the fifth. That's right, the Hajj. The Hajj is not supposed to be an obligation that puts any huge financial strain on a family. If you just can't afford it, if you're that poor, you never have to go. But you are encouraged to save up for your whole life, if necessary, to get to make your Hajj. There's a strong pressure for you to go. Some people go more than once, but everyone should go. And so if you have to save money from the time that you're a teenager until you're 50 years old to have the money to make your Hajj, you're supposed to make it. Now, men and women are included. Men, it is requisite for them to wear this two-piece white robe tunic that looks like a shroud, and they will be buried in something like it. Maybe not the one they wore on their Hajj, but something just like it. Women are already expected to be covered except for hands and face. They're not supposed to show anything else in public. And so whatever the woman is wearing is acceptable. But men are supposed to wear exactly the same thing so that the rich and the poor look exactly alike. It's a matter of getting everyone together. Again, there are certain things you're supposed to do when you're making a Hajj. You don't cut your hair, which would be a lot easier to identify if you were walking from Spain to the Middle East, and you're going to take a long time to do it. But, of course, most people are going to fly. Saudi Arabia is very strict. They do not admit people to Mecca who are not Muslims. So they check your credentials and they make sure that you are actually a Muslim, not an American reporter or curiosity seeker or something like that. They make sure, but people are flying into Saudi Arabia. It's a huge industry for them now. There are some other rules. They don't uproot any living thing. You're not supposed to pull a plant out of the ground or anything during a Hajj, that it's respect of life. And also, you should refrain from arguing or cursing. It's a time for you to be focused. Literally, when you start a Hajj, it is as if you are leaving life and embracing death. There is the symbolism of a Hajj is your journey through life to death. So it's time to kind of straighten up and act right. Other rituals, once you get to Mecca, you're expected to walk around the Kaaba 7 times, counterclockwise, which would be this way, wouldn't it? 7 times around it. And then the black stone that we talked about that they believe that Gabriel gave to Abraham for some reason. I'm not sure what it was supposed to mean to him. But as you walk around the Kaaba, you can touch that black stone. Then there's 2 hills in Mecca. You run between the 2 hills. And that symbolizes when Abraham had to force Hagar and Ishmael to leave them, that they had to flee. So you run 7 times between the 2 hills. Also on the Hajj, on the 8th day, one of the big things, and this was part of Muhammad's growing up as well. He was orphaned as a child, but they sent him out to live with the Bedouin in the desert, that there's a part of their culture that is wedded to the desert for lots of reasons. It's simplicity, it's camping out. Jews have the festival of Sukkot, of living in tents outside, but the Muslims go out to the desert, which is where their Arabic culture was first rooted. There's also the belief that there's demons out there, that you have the faith and the courage to go live among the jinn, that you're not going to be afraid to go live out there in that self-denial. That's part of it. The 9th day, there's the tradition of standing, and the entire community stands from noon until sunset. Again, the month of pilgrimage rolls around through the year, so there are times that's a solid 9-hour stand right there. But everyone is supposed to stand until sundown together as a sign of the unity of the whole world, or at least the whole Ummah, standing in obedience before God. There's also the ritual of stoning. You know the story of Abraham sacrificing in Christian and Jewish tradition, Yitzhak, but in their tradition, Ishmael. And Satan, who has no power, but Satan was trying to tempt Ishmael to run away, to not let his father sacrifice him. And Ishmael was so concerned to be obedient, if it was God's will for him to be sacrificed, that he threw stones at Satan to make him go away, to stop tempting him. And because Abraham was willing to sacrifice Ishmael, and Ishmael was willing to be sacrificed, they were the first true Muslims, because they made a total surrender. Near the end of their month of pilgrimage, every household is to sacrifice an animal and shares part of the meat with the poor. And whether you're on the Hajj or not, when that day comes in the month of pilgrimage, whether you're in the United States or Europe, you are to sacrifice an animal and share the meat with the poor. It's done there especially. And yet, Terry, I know the next question has got to be, do they do that here in America? And yes, it is done, not by everyone, but it is done.
During Ramadan, how do they look at drinking, drugs, watching TV, listening to music, worldly things?
Well, no one season is more holy than another. So their views of other things are about the same as other times of year. But I thought maybe that was the next slide, but it's not quite yet. They don't do anything that hurts their bodies. They don't drink alcohol. They don't use drugs. That is forbidden. Again,
At any time.
yeah, at any time. No, oh boy, they drink coffee. They drink coffee that's a syrup. When you're in the Middle East, out in the rural areas, you'll see a little fire and there's a pot hanging over the fire, and 8 or 9 guys kind of squat down around it, and they're waiting for that to boil down to a nice thick gravy-like consistency, and they pour that in a little cup, and yeah, they drink coffee. In fact, my last night in Egypt, we were going to fly from Egypt in the evening to Tel Aviv and then make a night flight from Tel Aviv to New York, and I ordered coffee with dinner because, there's not much else to order. It's water, coffee, kind of your choices. So I ordered coffee, and the Egyptian guide was sitting next to me, and they brought him an American cup of coffee, and they brought me an Egyptian cup of coffee. I'm like, why are they giving you American coffee? And he said, well, I can't drink that stuff. I drink 1 cup of that, and I don't sleep for 2 or 3 nights. Well, I drank it, and I was the only person awake on that flight from Tel Aviv to New York. I got up, marched up and down that great big airplane's aisles, tired, but could not close my eyes. They drink coffee. They shouldn't, but they drink coffee. Some other practices that are part of what identifies you as being a Muslim is there's no birth thing, there's no baptism of a child, but when a child is born, you're supposed to whisper into the child's ear that saying, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's prophet. On the 7th day, there's a sacrifice that's made, and on the 40th day, the mother is purified from the birth. But there's not the kind of rituals that Christians and Jews would have. Boys are, however, circumcised, and in modern times, the circumcisions oftentimes happen shortly after birth, which, frankly, is the only way it ought to be done. But they do, in many cultures, practice circumcision at the age of 11 or 12, and they try to make it a special deal. It's kind of the way we will do a baptism, that you're transferring from childhood into adult life. And they'll make the little boy feel very special. Dress him up like a prince and parade him around, and there's parties and festivals, because what they're going to do to him is going to be extremely painful, and you really got to add a lot of good stuff to that deal. But that is still a common practice, to circumcise at that transitional age. Again, traditional Islam teaches people to get married early, get married quick, have lots of kids. That's normal. That it's not, marriage is not done in a mosque. It's not a sacred event for them. Marriage is a contract between 2 people. They can divorce. They don't have a real heavy-handed negative view of divorce. But you are expected to get married and to have kids. And you're not supposed to have sex when you're not married. There's not supposed to be any premarital sex. There's not supposed to be any extramarital sex. But you should get married and have sex and have as many kids as you can. Rituals around dying. The one that I guess we all hear the most often is that Muslims don't embalm. And therefore, a person has to be buried within 24 hours of dying. So even the burial of the terrorist that was killed recently, Osama bin Laden, yeah. The burial at sea, which of course the at sea part was so that his grave didn't become a pilgrimage place for people to go to, but have to be buried right away. That is proper Muslim tradition. The guy that was in the car with Princess Diana back in, when was that, 1998 that she died, something like that. Very, very wealthy family, but he had to be buried immediately. Getting ready to bury Princess Di took a long time, lots of preparations. Elton John had to write a new song and all kinds of stuff. But when a Muslim dies, you're not put in a coffin. You're put in that same kind of white shroud that you wore when you go to the Hajj. They when you're dying, they turn your face towards Mecca. They whisper the prayer to you. And they read from this one surah number 36, that deals with death and resurrection. How's my time? What time is it? 7:10. 7:10. I guess I better start talking fast.
Roger, doesn't a Jew have to be buried within 24 hours also?
Is it 24 hours? They're buried in a pine box or wooden box. Most Jews do not want to be embalmed. Orthodox Jews are not embalmed. I think it's 48 hours, isn't it? Maybe 24. You could be right.
In the community where I live, before sundown, the same day.
Same day, really? Whew. I want you to be more sure than that. Let's not rush into this. I might just be sick. The ending of that particular surah, and most of the rest of it is very difficult to understand, says, has not man regarded how that we created him, we, the royal we, God speaking, of a sperm drop? Then lo, he is manifest adversary, and he has struck for us similitude and forgotten his creation. He says, who shall quicken the bones when they are decayed? Say, he shall quicken them, who originated them the first time. He knows all creation, who has made for you out of the green tree fire, and lo, from it you kindle. Is not he who created the heavens and earth able to create the like of them? Yes, indeed. He is the all-creator, the all-knowing. His command, when he desires a thing, is to say it to be, and it is. So glory be to him, in whose hand is the dominion of everything, and unto whom you shall be returned. Which is a long poetic way of saying, don't be scared of dying, because God can make you live again. But that is read to the person as they're dying. When they die, they are buried on their side, facing Mecca, and not in a coffin, just buried in the earth. In Islamic culture, they do.
States that way?
Pardon me?
Are they buried here in the States that way?
That's a good question, because that would be illegal in most communities. I don't know if there are exceptions for the creation of a Muslim cemetery, but that is part of their religious belief. So I suspect that states have to make exceptions for them. I don't know that for a fact. In fact, I had a lawyer tell me one time there are more laws about burial rights than anything else in America. And Kentucky has more than any other state. That's why when you're driving around rural parts of Kentucky, you'll get to a place in the road where the road divides and there's 2 gravestones out in the middle of the road, because you can't, very hard to move a graveyard in Kentucky. There's just a lot of laws around that stuff. And in Kentucky, you can't spread ashes like you can here in Missouri, because in Kentucky, you can never restrict someone's access to their ancestral burial ground. And so if you run out and spread ashes somewhere, the owner of that property may not want you there. So it has to be, ashes have to be buried in a particular site, so there can be no confusion about where you're buried. Art in Islamic culture, Muslims repeat that very strict Jewish teaching against making ever an image of God or of people or of animals or anything else. But because of that, their arts flourish in other areas, particularly in calligraphy. In mosques and sacred places, you see tremendous amount of Arabic written in an absolutely beautiful calligraphy. They also develop a lot in architecture. You can't make the image of an animal or something, but with straight lines and angles, they do tremendous things in architecture. Also famous for decor, printing patterns, poetry, and literature. They may, and there's not a lot of proof behind this, but like if you've traveled in Greece and in Italy and in Turkey, and they're showing you the ruins of Greek cities or Roman cities, and oftentimes the statues are missing the head or missing the face, many times they'll tell you that that was when Islam spread to the area and they defaced that kind of art that was objectionable to them. Now, there's other theories, but there are a lot of people, a lot of historians who will insist that that's why you'll find so many, particularly Roman statuary, where every part of it is okay except for the hands and the face, or have been beaten off for some reason. Sharia law, which is something that we hear a lot of talk about and with some anxiety these days. Sharia just means how to live the good life, or how to live with social ethics. There are nations that merge Sharia law with their government. That Iran and Pakistan are 2 examples of nations that live with a Muslim government. But there are exceptions. Turkey has a modern secular government. Iran used to have a secular government. Saudi Arabia had a secular, Iraq had a secular government. It remains to be seen how that's going to go. In Muslim countries, we've seen a lot of women in leadership, and it's one of the ironies, that we know in Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to drive. That's not a part of the Quran or the Hadith, obviously. It's not a part of official Muslim teaching. It's just a part of practice. And a lot of this business about sexuality, husbands and wives are supposed to celebrate sexuality a great deal, but you're not supposed to have sex in any other context. And so they want to protect their women from ever being sexually taken advantage of. And so they keep them covered, and you would have a practicing Muslim describe their treatment of women as not as treating them as inferior, but as treating them with greater respect and veneration. And there are some ways in which that's absolutely true. There are ways in which it is absolutely false. That even in court, where you have to have two men as witnesses of something, you can have one man and two women, but a woman's testimony is not equal to a man's. A woman's inheritance is half of what a man's is. Like if a man has a son and a daughter and his estate is being divided, the daughter will get 1/3 of the estate and the son will get 2/3. So saying that men and women are the equal in Islam is not really true. But if you dial back to the 6th century and say which of the world religions treated women the best, you'd have to say Islam. Better than Jews and Christians by far for the next 1,000 years. I think part of the problem there is that Islam has resisted change so much that the rest of the world has progressed in terms of gender relationships, and Islam is still struggling with some stuff that would appear to be very basic to us. Some other examples of Sharia. I've mentioned before, sexuality is considered as good, divorce is allowed. A man can have up to 4 wives, but a woman can have only 1 husband. And that's one of the areas of sharp discussion within Islam now, that really needs to be changed to a man can only have 1 wife. But a man can have up to 4 wives. And again, I've been in places where even that practice wasn't observed. Among the Bedouin that live in the deserts of Egypt, you can have a whole lot more than 4. You just have to be able to demonstrate that you can economically support them. Homosexuality, prostitution, and extramarital sex is forbidden. And again, there's been some very interesting writing among the gay community within Islamic countries about wanting to continue to be Muslim, but they're gay. And they want to be able to get Islam to evolve to put their arms around them the way that Christianity and Judaism has. I mean, none of us grew up in a world where homosexuality was accepted within Christian community. And now, I think even religious conservatives are nervous about being condemning of homosexuality. That maybe not many churches as open and affirming as we are, but nobody is happy about being condemning of the gay community. I want to believe that's true. Don't correct me if I'm wrong, okay? On that one, just let that one slide. In dietary laws, Muslims are forbidden to eat anything that's bad for them. And of course, as we all know, that's kind of a moving target, but that's why you don't eat pork. That's why you don't eat carrion. Carrion is not just a bird that eats dead animals, but anything that is a scavenger or that kills to eat, you're not supposed to eat. You don't eat blood, and you don't eat anything that was sacrificed in any non-Muslim ritual way. They don't want to eat anything that died of natural consequences or died in an accident or was killed by another animal. They only want to eat things that have been properly sacrificed by Islamic rules, which, we wouldn't differ with that very much. In financial stuff, Muslims are to refrain from gambling because no one should profit from someone else's loss. There should be no lying, cheating, theft, bribery, forgery, or any illegal gain. You should not try to earn a living at someone else's expense. You should not try to take advantage of someone else. You shouldn't try to exploit someone. And you should never charge interest, and you should never pay interest. I know one Muslim physician here in town who does not own his own home because he has not earned enough money to pay for a house outright. And he does not feel that he can, even if he has a significant down payment, borrow enough money to be able to buy a house. Now, there are some changes coming in that arena where there are some Muslim banks that find ways around these rules, that if you make a deposit, that it's like buying stock in the bank, and so you own part of the bank, and you can then have these stock transactions that amount to financing a house. But more observant Muslims, they just won't play that game. Just not going to do that. Finally, on Islam and terrorism, it's important for us to remember that while most of the terrorist violence that we hear about comes from Shiites, they still are just 15% of the Islamic world. 85% of Muslims are Sunnis. Now, when I was in graduate school, I was told that the Sunnis were virtually pacifists. That turns out to not be true. But a strictly observant Muslim understands the teaching that you only fight to defend yourself and your nation, that you should never fight for any reason but to defend yourself. But, you know, my dad always told me, don't bother a hornet and a hornet won't bother you. As long as you leave it alone, it'll leave you alone. The problem is that a lot of the hornets I ran into had paranoid personality disorders, and they thought I was threatening them even when I wasn't, and they would sting me anyway. So you have Muslims who feel like they are under attack, so that even a terrorist attack is defense of their culture, their religion, and their land. And a lot of that is because we put military bases in Saudi Arabia. If we had never put a base in Riyadh, there never would have been an Al-Qaeda. So it's just it's interesting that almost all of our foreign policy training, even when George W. Bush was president, Condoleezza Rice, very smart woman, very, very smart woman, but her PhD was in Russian studies and Cold War studies. That the United States has taken a long time to get ramped up into understanding that the real tension in the world now is not between communists and capitalists, it's between the West and Islam, and we've got to understand Islam better. For the most part, though, Muslims completely believe that suicide bombers are absolutely wrong, that they would never defend that. They believe that suicide is forbidden under all circumstances, and they believe that the innocent must never die, that there's no warfare in which it's okay to kill innocent people. So, and again, that becomes part of their provocation, because we're using these predator drones to take out targets, and we kill a lot of innocent people around our target. And we're not doing a body count, but you can bet their family and cousins are doing body counts. So that's something that we're going to have to continue to evaluate in terms of our own relationship with them. Yes, Anna.
Can Muslim men living in the United States can have few wives?
No, because polygamy is illegal in the United States.
Okay.
I have known of some cases where some guys had a wife and had some other women living in the house with them. But it's the kind of thing that you can be prosecuted for.
And what about abusing? Can a husband abuse a wife? And if their religion allowed them to do that?
Technically, in their religion, a man is allowed to use corporal punishment towards his spouse. But it's one of those things that's in the Quran that modern Muslims are really struggling with that. Now, it's not legal in the United States. And you know, the religion does not overwhelm the laws of the land, and so you can't assault just because your religion allows it. But I want to believe that in most emerging Muslim states that such things are still seen as assault. But we hear, you know, the media is not a cross-section test. If a family executes a daughter for having sex outside of marriage, we'll hear about that in the news, but I continue to believe that is not representative of the practice of Islam. Let me take one more question and then ask Rob to wrap up the recording. Anybody got one final shot? Good. Well, go in peace.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.